Good morning S3 and welcome to lesson number 4 of your S3 biology course. Today we are going to look at energy loss and pyramids. Now this is still to do with food chains and food webs, so if you are coming in straight to lesson 4 this morning, please go back and complete 1, 2 and 3 first, so this lesson then makes sense. So first thing we'll do is just a little recap on energy from previous lessons, just to make sure we're all clear on what it means to talk about energy when we're discussing food webs and food chains. When we've talked about food webs and food chains previously, we have been referring to the flow of energy. So when we draw out our food chain, you stick in a little arrow at each stage, and that is showing you how much energy is being passed on to the next thing. So when the insect eats grass, the energy is moving from the grass to the insect. When the bird eats an insect, the energy is moving into the bird. If you were to eat a packet of crisps and you're a human, that energy is moving into you. So you're getting your energy from a packet of crisps. So a quick reminder, when we're looking at arrows and we're talking about energy, it's the flow of energy from one thing to another that we're kind of focusing on within this topic. What actually happens to energy when we're looking at food chains? So obviously when you eat food, most of it you will use for various bodily functions. However, not all energy that you consume is passed on. Well, not so much you, but when an animal consumes something, not all that energy is passed on in a food chain. So hopefully if I explain this through, it'll make a little bit more sense. So there's 3 what we call fates of energy. And these are ways that energy can, first of all, we'll talk about be lost within a food chain. So when we're talking about animals, there's 3 ways it can be lost. So when an animal eats food, some of it will be undigested material. And by that, I mean poo. So an animal's digestive system will manage to absorb the majority of nutrients from the food it eats, but some of it will be left over because the stomach can't digest that anymore, and that will be lost. So in this case, the Mr. Cow here is going for a poo. In that poo, there is still some energy left from the food it eats. Interestingly, there are some animals that actually eat their poo. So rabbits will actually eat their poo and try and redigest the plant material that's been left over in the poo to try and make the most of that meal. Not all animals do this, obviously, but that's an example of some. So rabbits will actually go back and eat their poo to try and get even more energy out of their waste. So number 1, undigested material. So energy can be lost in a food chain because animals go to the toilet and some of the energy from their food is in their waste. Number 2, so warm-blooded animals have to keep warm. And to keep warm, if you imagine keeping a fire alive, you need to stock it with fuel, with wood. It's the same with animals. If we don't eat, we will struggle to keep our body temperature up. And by doing that, some of the food that an animal eats will be used to keep it warm. So use of energy number 2 is keeping warm. So the energy that's used to keep warm cannot be passed on to another animal in a food chain. Number 3 is movement. So most animals move, as we know. And in order for you to move and to run about, you need to eat food and you need to have energy. So that energy that's being used for movement cannot be passed on in a food chain. So just to summarise that, so there's 3 fates of energy when we're talking about loss. It can either be lost from a food chain by undigested material, it can be lost because animals are using that energy to keep warm, or they're using that energy to move. So this is energy that cannot be passed on through the food chain. The way that energy is passed on, so if it's not being used for these 3 things here, you can use energy for growth. So that is making you into a larger version of yourself. So when you use energy to grow, you will build muscle or you'll build fat. And in those tissues, there's essentially energy stored. So when you eat meat, you're getting energy from the material that you're eating. So the energy that's used from growth, if something was then to eat this large cat, they would get energy from that cat, from the stuff that is stored in its muscle or in its fat. So yes, 3 ways it can be lost. 1 way that it's used to be passed on in a food chain is by growth. So it's not an exact science, but if we think about how much energy is passed on at each stage. So I said before, it's not 100% of the grass's energy and it's not 100% of the insect's energy that's passed on. It's only actually ever 10% of energy is passed on at each stage. So the 10% of the insect's energy and 10% of the bird's energy is passed on. The rest is all lost. So the other 90% is lost by your growth. No, not by your growth. By your movement, by your warmth, and by your undigested material, which is waste. There we go. So if 10% of energy is passed on at each stage, that actually means that 90% of energy is lost at each stage of a food chain. And that is being recycled back into the environment. So essentially, like if you take waste, for example, when an animal poos on the ground, there are then bacteria that will break that down and they're going to recycle that energy back into the ground, which can then be used for other organisms or plants and so on to grow. So it's all like cycles. So it's not that it just disappears, because that would break laws of physics, but it's used up one way or the other, whether it's being recycled back into the ecosystem or it's being used to help the organism stay alive. So, and then you would lose another 90% here. So actually, as you go along, so a wee recap, you've got energy coming from the sun that's being absorbed into the grass, and then that energy from the grass is being passed on to the insect, but only a certain percent will get passed on. The insect will be eaten by the small bird, but the small bird can only access about 10% of that energy, and then the buzzard will eat small bird, and it can only access about 10%. The rest of that energy is being lost either by movement, warmth, or waste. So, I think that's all for that slide. Because this looks a little bit messy, what you see just now with kind of 10% and 90% kind of flying about and kind of little annotations, is lost. So 3 different ways. Energy is lost from a food chain via undigested material, i.e. poo, keeping warm, and for movement. The energy that is kept or that is passed on is used for growth. That bulks up the animal that's being eaten, and then that energy can be passed on in the food chain. At each stage, only 10% is passed on, the other 90% is lost by movement, warmth, and waste, like we said before. You've then got your... So the next thing we need to think about is how we can represent that information that we just spoke about, so the losing 10% of energy at each level, and the different levels within a food chain in a diagram. These diagrams are called pyramid diagrams. And there's 2 pyramids that you need to know about. So there's a pyramid of energy, because that's what we've been talking about today already. And then there's also a pyramid of numbers. Made that too big. So these are the 2 that you need to know about when we talk about pyramids. So, first of all, we're going to look at a pyramid of energy, and we're going to look at this food chain here that we've been looking at already. So the point of a pyramid of energy, it will show you how much energy is at each level of a food chain. Level of a food chain. Now, when I say levels, that essentially means each kind of organism that you can see. So there'll be the grass level, insect level, small bird, and buzzard. Okay, now, knowing what they said before, that only 10% of energy is passed on at each stage, that means that your producer level, which is at the very bottom of your food chain, so in this case our grass, is going to contain the most energy because it is the producer, it's closest to the sun, it's at the bottom of the food chain. So it's always the case, your producers will contain the most energy. So what you'll do is you're going to put in a bottom layer to your pyramid, and I'm going to colour code these as I go just to kind of keep it clear. So bottom layer will be your grass. Now when we draw these, we're not actually drawing them out like graphs, and we're not measuring boxes based on levels of energy. It's just a kind of schematic diagram. So if we go to the next level, which is your insects, so these guys, you would describe them as consumers because they're eating grass, and they're also herbivores because they're eating plant material. So there's going to be energy loss because we're only passing on 10%. So your next level, if it's to kind of represent energy, is going to be slightly shorter. Just go like that. Right, in insects. And then hopefully you can see a pattern emerging. So if we look at small birds, only 10% of that energy has been passed on. So that next level is going to be slightly smaller. And the buzzard, who is at the top of the food chain. So your pyramid of energy is showing you that as you go up the food chain, you're going to have energy lost at each level. So 10% of energy is passed on here, 10% is passed on, and 10% is passed on. And you can represent it in this type of diagram. So the next type of pyramid we can look at is a pyramid of numbers. Now we're going to use exactly the same food chain again, and we'll think about numbers. So a pyramid of numbers, instead of showing how much energy it's each level, it's actually showing you the number of organisms within each level. Cool. So pyramid of energy shows the amount of energy each level. Pyramid of numbers shows the number of organisms at each level. So in this case, if you think about in the real world and you were looking at a field with insects, small birds and buzzards, you need to think about the number you would see around you. Now when we talk about grass, we're talking about blades of grass, so there's going to be loads of grass in comparison to the number of buzzards. So you would draw in your bottom level as having lots of grass, and I'm just going to colour not like that. There we go. So lots of grass at the bottom level, and then there's going to be slightly fewer insects than there is grass. So you label it like that, and then you can probably see what's going to happen. There's going to be less small birds than there are insects, and then there's going to be less buzzards than there are small birds. So in this case, you get a pyramid shape describing the number of organisms at each level of your food chain. So you're going from most to least. So in this case, this is like a traditional pyramid shape. Sometimes you will get a strange situation. So we're going to look at this food chain here, which has an oak tree, which is the producer, again some insects, and then a woodpecker at the top of the tree. If we were to talk about a pyramid of energy, that oak tree would still contain the most energy because it's the producer and it's closest to the sun, so it's able to store a lot of energy. And then we've still got a 10% loss, so the insects would have slightly less, or 10% pass on should I say, and then the woodpecker would have slightly less again. So your pyramid of energy looks like it did before. In this case though, if you think about a pyramid of numbers, if we're talking about a single oak tree, it's actually able to sustain a population of many insects and potentially a few woodpeckers. So it's not like a field where you've got lots of blades of grass. We're actually talking about one single oak tree here looking after a population. So if you imagine you've got a tree, and then you're going to have lots of insects living within a tree. So it's not just you have one insect in a tree. And then on that tree, you might have two little woodpeckers that like to live in that tree. I realise birds don't look like that, give them some wings. So your pyramid of numbers is going to look slightly different this time because you've got one oak tree. So if you represent that as one level, you've then got lots of bugs. So the next level is going to be slightly bigger. And then in our case, we've got two woodpeckers, so it's going to be slightly more broad like that. So that is your producer at the bottom, who is then sustaining a large number of insects, who is then home to a few woodpeckers. So your pyramid here actually doesn't look like a pyramid at all. And the thing is, your pyramid of numbers is the only pyramid that might have an unusual shape. Pyramid of energy always looks like this. So your producers are the largest level at the bottom, and then it decreases as you go through the food chain. A pyramid of numbers might look a bit skew-if because you could have just one producer supporting lots of consumers. Another example that I've got here, so imagine this is the Scottish Highlands, you've got some heather that grows on the side of the hill, you've got one deer that is feeding off of that heather, which could be home to lots of ticks. So there could be, in this case, 5 ticks living on that one deer. And this, again, does not look like a normal pyramid, but it would still be described as a pyramid of numbers. The pyramid of energy, you would still have the most energy in the heather, and then slightly less in the deer, and then slightly less again in the ticks, in that kind of traditional shape. So, okay, so to recap what we've went through today, 3 ways that energy can be lost is via movement, through waste, and also through warmth, or keeping warm. These 3 ways are which 90% of energy is lost from a food chain, so that is lost either to the environment or it's used up by the organism itself. The remaining 10% is what can be passed on at each stage in a food chain, and that is used primarily for growth, and then that energy can be passed on. We then spoke about diagrams, in particular our pyramids. 2 types of pyramids, a pyramid of numbers and a pyramid of energy. Your pyramid of energy is showing us how much energy is at each level of food chain, so it has a traditional kind of pyramid shape, showing us energy loss as we go through the different levels. Your pyramid of numbers is telling us how many organisms are at each level in a food chain. This can look like a traditional pyramid shape or can look a bit skew-if depending on how many organisms are in each level. So that is it for today. Your tasks have been set on Teams. This video will be uploaded onto Teams as well and onto YouTube, and I hope you all have a good day.